Hey, good to have everybody with us tonight, and hope that you're having a good week. Not the storms have basically passed through. We need to make sure we keep the people up in the northeast coast in our prayers, because that hurricane that's going up there, even though they don't think now it's going to strike blunt force into inland, is still going to cause a lot of damage, rain and other things. And that ground up there, they say, is really soaked good, so this rain is going to really hurt them. So let's keep them in our prayers. I want to deviate just a little bit before we go into a resumption of our Acts 14 study. I want to talk just for a moment about the birthplace of Jesus. When you think of Bethlehem, what do you think of? You think maybe place of big or medium size or something of that nature? Actually, it was quite small. Nazareth, of course, was a city in Galilee. It's insignificant except for the place. It was the place that Jesus was raised. It was the place from which his parents came. Josephus, a first century historian, told us in his writings that 204 cities were named in his writings in that area of Galilee, but not one mention of Nazareth. Isn't that interesting? The Talmud listed 63 cities in Galilee, and again, not one time was Nazareth mentioned. I found that very interesting. Just a little bit of tidbit of information. Also, a little trivia question for you. What is the shortest verse in the New Testament?
Jesus wept.
Yeah, everybody thinks Jesus wept. In the English, it is the shortest verse, containing the shortest amount of letters. In the original, John 11:35, Jesus wept, is 3 words and more letters, but the shortest verse in the original is 1 Thessalonians 5:16. Rejoice evermore. It's only 2 words in the original and less letters in it. So just a little trivia, something. Somebody ever asked you, what's the shortest verse in the New Testament? Wait a minute, it's not the one everybody thinks it is. It's a different one. But then again, it depends on what language you're using. By the way, if I remember correctly, and this is just an odd remembrance, I don't know if it's accurate or not, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the shortest verse in the Bible is in the Old Testament, not in the New. All right, let's go and resume our study in Acts chapter 14. And when there was in verse 5 we begin today, and when there was an assault made both of the Gentiles and also the Jews with their rulers to use them despitefully and to stone them, they were aware of it and fled unto Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth round about. So it seems that a plot was uncovered, that they were going to attack Paul and Barnabas, and somehow or another somebody became aware of it, probably the disciples, but how they became aware of it is unknown. We don't know how it was revealed. We don't know if it was someone who was associated with the plotters or those who had been informed by them that this was going to take place and thought, maybe this is going a little too far. Or it could have been someone who had overheard a conversation, like, for instance, later in Acts when Paul's nephew overheard a plot to kill him if the Romans took him down to meet with the Sanhedrin. One thing I think we can be fairly certain of, it was not a miraculous knowledge that was given. The indication from the original seems to be that this was something that was heard by someone, again, whether it be a disinfected plotter or one of the brethren overhearing something, whatever it was, something that was actually heard by someone, not revealed to them. And notice their intent was to use them despitefully. And a second part of that is to stone them. Now, the way we use the word despitefully, we would probably combine the stoning and despitefully and thinking, this is a despicable act and it's despiteful that they're going to stone them. But in the original, there is a difference between them. The word despitefully, hubrizo, means to exercise violence, that is abuse. Now that could go all the way to stoning them, but since these two words are used together, it would seem to indicate that some kind of abuse, it could be verbal, it could be physical, whatever it was, they were going to do that to them. Thayer adds the idea that it means to treat shamefully. And that could also have a wide variety of meanings as to how they treated them. But it seems to be more the idea of violence, because the word inheres that, inheres, anyway, you know what I mean. That idea of more than just threats, but some kind of physical violence. Of course, stoning, it carries the idea with it. Stoning was meant to cause someone to lose their life, to kill them, in other words. In this case, it would have been murdering them because they didn't do anything to deserve to be stoned to death. And that also indicates to us this idea of stoning, since the Gentiles did not use that method of killing people, then it seems to indicate that it was the Israelites or Hebrews that were behind this idea of putting them to death through the act of stoning. And so when this news was learned, what did the apostles do? They fled. They went to Lystra and Derbe. This reminds us of something Jesus told the 70 when he sent them out, and also, if memory serves me correctly, the apostles were told the same thing. In Matthew 10:23, we find, when they persecute you in this city, what? Flee ye into another. Now that also raises a question. What kind of persecution? Any persecution that comes along? Well, stop and think about that idea of persecution. Persecution can be the extreme of putting somebody to death, or extreme physical punishment of a person, but persecution can also be sneers, can it? When you proclaim that you're a Christian in the workplace, and somebody, that is a form of persecution. So what does it mean when you're persecuted in this city, flee to another? The idea would seem to be minor persecutions are not under consideration. A minor persecution would be someone who objects to what we say and tries to argue against it in nonviolent terms. It could be that position. So I would dare say that what Jesus was getting at is, when it's a severe persecution and you might lose your life, then go ahead and flee to another city. God never intended for us to be voluntary what's the word I'm looking for? I've gone blank on it. I've lost it. Voluntary. And I don't suppose any of you can help me out.
Victim?
Martyrs. There, thank you, Catrice. God never intended for us to be voluntary martyrs, nor did He intend for us to be so objectionable to people that it causes any kind, whether violent or nonviolent, persecution against us. He doesn't want us to be so obnoxious that we do that. Now look at verse 14 and 7. It tells us what they did when they fled to these two cities. And there they preached the gospel. Persecution, notice, did not stop the disciples from proclaiming the gospel. If you won't listen to us, okay, we'll go somewhere else. We'll go find somebody that will listen. It seemed to have motivated them. Hey, they're persecuting us here, but you know what? There are other plants out there to water. There are other plants out there to reap from, and we're going to go to them. We'll go to those people who have that kind of a nature. So why would I say it seemed to motivate them? Do you remember Matthew 5:12? Jesus talks about blessed are they who are persecuted. Why? Because it proclaims basically what the passage is telling, because it proclaims who you belong to. They wouldn't persecute you if you are the world. They wouldn't persecute you necessarily because you like this political party or that political party. They wouldn't spit on you because you root for this team or you're a football player for this team and the other. They knew who they belonged to, and they knew what He expected of them. And so they fulfilled their purpose. Question: do we truly understand who we belong to, and are we fulfilling our purpose? You know, sometimes I know questions I'll ask seem like, well, that's awful simple. Why, you're preaching to the choir. But if I were teaching this class in a congregation where every one of these pews these seats were filled, might there be some in those seats who would say, yeah, I know who I belong to, but deep down inside they haven't truly committed themselves yet. Therefore, they do not truly understand who they belong to? That maybe they think they can have one foot in the world and one foot in religion and everything's okay? There are always fence straddlers around. Let's look at verse 8. And there sat a certain man at Lystra. Okay, they left Iconium and they've gotten to Lystra. A certain man at Lystra, impotent in his feet, being a cripple from his mother's womb, who never had walked. There's some important things mentioned here. First of all, the general idea is no medicine can help this guy. There's not a medicine out there that you can give him and take these pills and, or drink this liquid and he's going to be cured. Further, there's no therapy that can be given to him. Jenny was so patient with me. Years and years ago, I had a leg torn up really bad playing basketball with the brethren. Brethren were hard on me. And this knee got torn all to pieces. And I had to go to therapy day after day after day. Usually about 4 hours, if I remember right, wasn't it? About 4 hours a day? It wasn't one. It took too long for them to just even start the therapy on me. But it took me years and years of therapy to really get back. And now, I only saw the therapist for about 6 months to a year, somewhere in there. But every day, sometimes maybe 1 degree of movement regained in that knee. It took a long time for the muscles to get strong enough to support me and allow me to walk. What this shows us about the terms that are used about this man here, number one, he wasn't faking his condition. And number two, we're going to notice that it was instantaneous. He didn't just have to go through all this therapy to get the muscle strength back to be able to use the leg like I did, he jumped up immediately when Paul told him to, as we're going to notice, and he began jumping up and down. I'd like to have seen me do that. I'd end up right flat on my face if I'd have tried it back in that time. Notice it also tells us that Paul didn't hire someone like the Billy Graham Crusades to pretend, or Ernest Angley. I've actually literally watched him on television do that, where he had gotten somebody to fake a problem and then, he healed them. How gullible a lot of people are. He hadn't been paid to pretend he was a cripple so that Paul could pretend to heal him. The context indicates that he was healed immediately. Again, look at the description. He was impotent in his feet. He had no strength in his feet. He was a cripple from his mother. In other words, he was born a cripple. He didn't become a cripple. He was born a cripple. And notice the next phrase, who never had walked. Emphatic. He had never walked. Also, the context indicates that seems to indicate that there was no synagogue in Lystra. Probably this took place, and Paul's speaking in this city probably took place near the city gate. Archaeologists tell us that in these ancient cities, there would generally be an open space near or at the gate, and this is where people gathered to discuss business or to take matters of law to the elders of the city to make judgments on these people. Also, some have falsely argued that the events that are portrayed here are the same ones that were portrayed in Acts chapter 3. Now, why do they do that? It's so that they can say, well, Dr. Luke wanted Paul to appear to be just as powerful and be able to do everything Peter could do, and so he just copied it and just put different names into it. That's not the case. And you say, well, Bob, how do you know that? Because if you look at the two accounts carefully, you'll see there are a lot of differences. There are critical differences in it. For instance, in Acts 14 and 8, you find that the man was healed. He had great faith. The text we're looking at now. But notice the healed man in Acts chapter 3 had no faith. Isn't that interesting? There doesn't talk about him having any faith at all. It talks about him begging for alms. He was expecting to get something material physically, but he had no hope of being healed. Notice the man in Acts chapter 14, the context shows that he was listening to Paul's teaching, and interestingly enough, the word for listening to his teaching shows us that it was a continuous action that had been ongoing. In other words, this wasn't the first time that he heard Paul preach whatever hope and good news that he heard. It had been an ongoing thing. This was not just, and then Paul healed him. And notice again in Acts chapter 3, the man was only interested in alms. But again in Acts 14, the man was interested in what Paul was teaching before Paul healed him. In Acts chapter 14, there is no mention of Paul's poverty. But notice in Acts chapter 3, Peter proclaimed, I don't have any alms to give you. In other words, I don't have any material thing. I don't have any money to give you. That's what the beggar was asking for, the crippled man. In Acts chapter 14, a sermon preceded the miracle. We've already mentioned this. In Acts chapter 3, a miracle preceded the sermon. That's a lot different. In Acts chapter 14, the miracle was performed among the Gentiles and probably to a Gentile. I say probably. In Acts chapter 3, it was done in Jerusalem at the temple to a Jew. Not to a Gentile, to a Jew. Further, in Acts chapter 14, the miracle was apparently, again, performed on a Gentile, but again, in Acts chapter 3, upon a Jew. When you put these two accounts side by side, there are more differences in the account than similarities. And yet these false teachers, some of them today, I read this in at least 3 different commentaries written by denominationalists. The similarities are far outweigh the, wait a minute, how can they outweigh when there are more dissimilarities than similarities? Look at verse 9 and 10. The same heard Paul speak. Now, we've gone over some of these ideas in what we just presented about the similarities and dissimilarities. The same heard Paul speak, who steadfastly beholding him and perceiving that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on thy feet." And he leaped and walked. Now notice, first of all, he had been listening to Paul. And again, excuse me, the idea of speaking here, the original shows it wasn't a one-time thing. He had been listening to Paul and was continuing to listen to Paul preach the gospel. This crippled man, notice, was actively listening to Paul. He wanted to hear what was being said. And since faith comes by hearing, hearing by the Word of God, as he heard the Word of God, his faith grew to the point where at some point Paul, either by miraculous revelation or because he had been watching this man's reaction to what he said, knew that this man truly believed what he was hearing. He'd taken the right first step. Don't you wish we could convince everyone to take that first right step? To listen with interest, to listen with an honest heart, being willing, if they heard the truth, to then obey that truth? The verb tense again here indicates a perpetual hearer of Paul's message. He continually listened. Next we notice the phrase, who steadfastly beholding him. This is talking about Paul. It's not talking about the man who would be healed. Paul had fixed his eyes on this crippled man. That's the word steadfastly. He fixed his eyes on him. Basically, he's speaking, but doing what I'm doing right now and looking right at Catrice. And as I talk, I just keep talking, but I'm looking at her. I'm not looking at everybody else. You know, we preachers are taught in the schools that, you know, we need to keep our eyes going so that everybody thinks we're talking to them. And we are, but it gives an added incentive to those who are sitting in an audience. Why did Paul fix his eyes on him? Maybe it was the attention that he was giving to what Paul said. Maybe the Holy Spirit told him to really notice this man. We don't know exactly what it was. But something caused Paul to fix his eyes on this crippled man as he listened to Paul. And perceiving that he had faith to be healed. Notice that word perceiving. Generally speaking, it's been my experience when people talk about perceiving something, they're talking about they saw something with their eyes. but it doesn't tell you what they saw. Was it an action? Was it an attitude that you can see by a person's body language, or what was it? This man, Paul, was able to see in some way that he believed he could be healed. Now, of course, we need to back up just for a second and briefly remind ourselves that in Mark 16:20, we're told that miracles were performed by the apostles for the purpose of confirming the word. Here was a great opportunity for Paul to do exactly that. He found a man who was really interested, but this man had a problem. He was a cripple from his mother's birth, or from his mother's womb. He was a cripple, never had walked. Bingo! Here's a perfect opportunity, if God will let me, to heal this man and thus confirm everything I've been speaking to this crowd about, even though this man already believes it. Heal from what? The word healed comes from sozo, and it means to save. Watch this, the definitions here. It means to save, deliver, or protect. That's according to Strong. Thayer says it means to save, to keep safe, and sound. And Zojati says to save, deliver, make whole, preserve safe from danger. What is the majority of those definitions? How would you interpret then that passage? Was he telling him to deliver him from his crippled condition? Or was he talking about salvation? I believe the implication is that he was talking to him about salvation, with the added bonus, so to speak, that he would be saved from his crippled condition. He would be delivered from that condition, Strong. He would be safe. Well, just because a man was crippled and he was now made able to walk, does that mean he's going to be safe? But if he's saved and continues in that salvation that has been given to us by Christ, you see the difference? I believe the implication is that he's talking about healing him spiritually. I believe the text should read, perceiving that he had faith to be saved. And again, relying upon those multiple definitions in the Greek lexicons. He said with a loud voice, Paul spoke up, and notice it says he said with a loud voice. Why didn't it just say, and he spoke, or he said? Why is it added, said with a loud voice? It's not necessary, the words loud voice, to get across the idea that Paul said something, that Paul told this man something. He wanted everyone to hear exactly what he said. You ever been in a position where you needed to speak up so that everybody could hear what you said? And we all have. Paul wanted everybody to hear what he said to this man. Why? Because when they heard Paul's words and then saw the miracle, they're going to pay even more attention to what he has to say after that, aren't they? Again, that's fulfilling what Jesus said miracles were for. Mark 16:20. Well, what did Paul say to this man? Stand up on thy feet. Stand up. If you had been crippled all of your life, never having the strength in your bones or your muscles to stand up, what might your reaction be? You think you would think, wait a minute, I've never been able to do this. I've never been able to make my legs move the way they ought to. But notice what this man did. Since this man had faith to be saved, do you think he then obeyed the gospel later? I do. As soon as this man was told what to do, what did he do? Well, let me think this over. I don't know. That seems awful strange to me. Can you imagine what the other folks were saying who knew that, had known this man for some amount of time, who knew that he wasn't faking? Who does he think he is telling this man to get up? Like, doesn't he know he's a cripple? If he knew he was a cripple, he wouldn't be asking him, he wouldn't tell him to stand up. Don't you think someone would have been thinking along those lines? But notice this man. He leaped up. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the opinion of the audience or whether he could do it or not, or have to think this over. He leaped up. And what did he do? He walked. Bowles states that the Greek here is halatokia per epatii. And what he says that means is, literally, he leaped up with a single bound and began to walk. I'll tell you what, after that surgery they did on my knee, I wish the doctor could have told me, get up and walk. Get up and go run and play basketball some more. But that doesn't happen, does it? Again, it points out the miracle that had taken place. He didn't have to struggle. He didn't have to exercise for months. He leaped up and he walked. Well, a question then arises, how did the crowd as a whole react to this miracle? Excuse me, having a little trouble with heartburn. Look at verse 11 and 12. And when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. And they called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. What had God done through Paul? He gave these people the evidence that they understood that a man all by himself couldn't do what was done. Only God, in their minds, only a God could do what Paul and Barnabas did. So they recognized something that a lot of people today fail to recognize. Some man gets up in front and says, I'm going to heal this guy, and either faking or not, they supposedly heal the guy. They can't do it. Only God can do it. Is it any wonder then that some of these men who have pretended to do these things draw such great crowds to themselves? Because people aren't totally stupid. They know that a man all by himself can't do that. It has to take an action by God. God had already come to mankind in human form, the Emmanuel, God with us. And God's not coming back to this world again in any form whatsoever. Not literally on this earth. A virgin shall be with child. I read something the other day that I thought was interesting about that phrase. A virgin shall be with child, Matthew 1:23. Because we're also told that Joseph did not know her until after Jesus was born. not only was a virgin with child, a virgin gave birth to a child, the Jesus. And she shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. I've thought about that word a lot of times. Can there be any sweeter name in all of this world? Emmanuel, when we understand the meaning, God with us. And it also causes me to consider that for Christians who are striving to the best of our ability, even with all of our weaknesses, God is still with us, not physically like Jesus was, but spiritually. Who did they think Paul and Barnabas were? Well, they called Barnabas Jupiter. Why Jupiter? Well, Jupiter was the king of the gods of Roman mythology. Zeus was the Greek god or head of the gods in Greek mythology. Interestingly, in the original, here it's Zeus. The original text says Zeus here. Now they call Paul Mercurius or Mercury. Now Mercury was considered by the Romans to be the god of, watch this, merchants. He was also the god of thieves. Wait a minute, doesn't that seem like an oxymoron? How can he be the god of the merchants, but also the thieves who steal from the merchants? Doesn't make sense to me. And also tricksters. In Greek mythology, he was the quick messenger, the speedy messenger of the gods. You see how they equated the name to each of these individuals? Now, some have assumed that Paul had spoken to them in the Greek language, but he did not understand the language of the Lycaonians. Does something bother you about that? Again, I've read this in a number of commentaries written by denominational teachers. They assume that Paul didn't speak their language and couldn't understand what they were saying or what they were doing. But did not Paul have all the gifts that the other apostles had? And wasn't one of those gifts they had, Acts chapter 2, the ability to speak in languages, and therefore they'd had to understand what they were saying, would they not? They all had the gift of languages. So why assume that Paul couldn't speak to them in their own language? Number one, that he spoke to them in Greek. Why assume that he could not understand what they were saying? The second assumption, which is based on the first assumption of these writers, was that they didn't understand that they were being called gods. If I can speak in any language that the Holy Spirit gives me the ability to, and I have fled to this city, obviously with the approval of God, no condemnation is given where they went when they left Iconium, then He will give me the ability to speak to these people in the language they can understand. Why not assume instead, if you're going to assume, that they were simply waiting for the noise of the crowd to subside so that they could then tell them, you can't, if a mob is all of them protesting something, you can't get your voice heard by all of them. The only way to do that is for them to calm down, to stop speaking, and then you can speak to them and they can hear you. Look at verse 13. Then the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates, and would have done sacrifice with the people. Jupiter, Zeus, was the patron god of the cities of the Lycaonians. Lycaonians, I should say. Since the people thought they were gods, what are they going to do? And by the way, archaeology has uncovered many statues devoted to Zeus in that area, and writings that have been found proclaiming Zeus or Jupiter to be their god, their primary god. So since the people thought that they were God, well, what are they going to do? What do you do for God? Don't we give him sacrifices? Now, in our time, we don't offer an animal or something of that nature. We don't go and bow down before a statue that supposedly represents this God or that God. Do we render still service? Do we render sacrifices to our God? As a Christian, I ought to be able to say, yep, we sure do. I sacrifice time for him, don't you? I could sit home on Sunday morning if I so chose and watch a football game. That wouldn't be any sacrifice to God. The sacrifice to God is giving up something that normally would be right in and of itself, and take the time to come to a place and to spend my time and give of my energy to worship him. Would it not? Do I sacrifice in material things? Now, they were going to give an ox, probably an ox, to, and maybe some other animal as well, in sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas, thinking they were gods. But do we as Christians, are we expected to make a sacrifice of our material things? Are we not supposed to sacrifice time and abilities to help others know the truth? Yeah, sacrifice is required by God. And in our world around us, those who think that they're worshiping a God who is not a God, cannot be a God, do they not also make sacrifices for their God? Look at verse, let's go ahead and stop. We'll pick back up with verse 14 next week. I hope that this is our study tonight, and offering our thoughts can help each one of us to do more study for ourselves, and also to have some better understanding of God's Word.